Hi everyone, I'm Gertie and welcome back to our Fit Clinic series. This is our fourth Fit Clinic and I am so excited to be bringing you one of our most requested topics. We're going to be talking about small and full bust adjustments today. Now, the great thing about the charm range is that we do have A through H cups included on every pattern. So we will hopefully get you close to a good bust fit right out of the package. But if you fall outside of that range, we're going to show you today how to make those adjustments. And one thing that I'm really excited that we're doing today is I've noticed that a lot of tutorials for bust adjustments will just show you how to make the changes on a standard block or a pattern that just has a bust dart and a waist dart. But we do patterns with a lot of different style lines. So today I'm going to take you through first your standard full and small bust adjustment on a block with darts. And then we're going to look at a pattern with a gathered bust that gets sewn into a midriff and a princess seam. So hopefully between those three styles, you will get a sense of the principles that go into bust adjustments and be able to alter any pattern that you need to. So let's go ahead and get started talking about bust fit. Okay, so to get started, we're going to talk a little bit about bust fitting basics. So to start with, I just want to say that bust fitting is all about width and length through the bust. So you're going to hear me saying that a lot, okay? So that's something that I want you to keep thinking about as we go forward. Do I need to add length or remove length or add width or remove width, okay? So be thinking about that. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is bust fitting and cup sizes in sewing patterns. One common comment I see sometimes is, people will ask, well, I wear a J cup bra. What do I do in charm patterns? So just to reiterate, I know we talked about this in the first Fit Clinic, but it's really important to note that bra cup sizes and sewing pattern cup sizes are totally different, okay? So don't even think about your bra cup size, right? We're going to be thinking about your sewing pattern cup size. And also, just to review, the way that you get your sewing pattern cup size is you measure your high bust, right, which is under the armpits here, and then you measure your full bust, which is over the fullest part of the bust. And you're looking at the difference between those two measurements. So in the charm patterns world, in our size chart, if the difference between those two measurements is ½ inch, then you're an A cup. If it's 2 inches, then you're a B/C cup. If it's 3 inches, you're a D/double D, and so on. All right, so the difference is what determines your cup size. Also worth noting that we group sizes together because sewing pattern cup fitting is less specific than a bra cup fitting, right? So that means that we are able to group things like a B and a C into one cup size, okay? So keep that in mind. Now, the way that we draft our cup sizes here at Charm is that we start with our sample size, okay? Our sample dress and cup size. And then for each cup size that we add or remove, we're either adding or removing an inch of fullness, okay? So let's say we start with the D/double D cup size. To get up to the F/G cup, we would be adding an inch of fullness. To go down to the C, we'd be removing an inch of fullness. The only difference is that A cup, which I told you, which is only ½ an inch difference between the high cup and the high bust and the full bust. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is how can you do that at home. So let's say you're starting with an H cup, you want to add an inch of fullness to get to the next cup size up, like we would do if we kept adding, more cup sizes on top of our range. So that's what we're talking about today. Let's take a look at the supplies you're going to want to have on hand for making pattern adjustments. So you're going to want your pattern piece, the front bodice, but also worth noting that you're going to need to make adjustments to, like, let's say there was a facing that gets sewn to this. You're going to want to have that handy too, or the lining, whatever it may be. So have those pieces handy because these bodice changes can affect other adjoining pieces. You're going to want your 2x18 gridded ruler and possibly a French curve if you like to use a French curve. And then tape is really important because we're going to be doing surgery on these pattern pieces and taping them back together. Pins, a tracing wheel, and if you can find a spiky one, that's good because we're going to be truing darts and you're going to want it to go through several layers of paper. For pencils, I like to have my regular lead pencil, but then also colored pencils in a few different colors. So if you're making multiple changes, you can tell which round you're on by the color you're using. And then some extra paper. So it can be pattern making paper, which is what we're using right here with the numbers on it. But you could also just use plain white paper, butcher paper, craft paper, whatever it is that you use to do your pattern changes. But you'll want something to tape your pattern pieces onto when we're doing all of this cutting and taping and all of that. And then just some paper scissors. And those are your supplies. Okay, so let's take a look at diagnosing fit issues on a small bust. So we have sewn up a muslin of the night and day dress, the square neck version, in a B/C cup, and we're looking at it on a mannequin with a very small bust. So you'll see on this one that it's not super obvious, but there are a couple little telltale signs of a bust not fitting well. And one of them here is that you're seeing this sort of like sunkenness between the bust right here. So we don't want to see that. And the other thing that you may see is this sort of like sagginess at the bust, right? So there's just a little extra room in here. One thing that I always encourage you to look at too is the waistline, okay? So sometimes in a small bust, you will see at the center front across here, the waist will be dipping down below the natural waistline because there's too much bust room. In this case, I don't see that though, so it's interesting. What I do see is too much width. We just talked about the basics of bust fitting. Too much width, and maybe just the tiniest bit of too much length right across the bust, but I wouldn't go crazy adjusting the length on this one because then it's going to get too short in the waist. Of course, you will be making a second muslin, right? So you can always diagnose those fit issues and make adjustments again. But don't go crazy if you're seeing that this is lining up at the waist. The other thing that you can do is turn it to the side here and see if it's level from front to back at the waist, because that's what you're looking for, is for it to be level. Now, the other thing, which we're not really going to get into a ton today, is dart placement. This is a good time to be looking at that. You can see that this waist dart is very high on her, right? So it's coming up all the way to the apex. And the general recommendation is that you want the dart to fall about an inch shy of the apex. Now, there's a little wiggle room in vintage because in this era, in the 50s, there were darts that went all the way over the bust, and it was just part of the look. So don't feel like you have to go with the standard rule if you like the more vintage look. But if you prefer a more modern look, you would take that dart down about an inch. Okay, so let's look at reducing the cup size on this. Like I said, we're not going to do a full cup size, but we may do about a half cup size for her. Okay, so let's look at those pattern adjustments. Okay, in this section, we're going to talk about how to do a small bust adjustment on a pattern like the night and day dress. And the reason we chose the night and day dress is because it's almost like a block or a sloper, right? It has a bust dart and a waist dart. So we're going to get into different styles later, but this is sort of like the basic bust adjustment that you will do, the type of pattern you would do it on. So this is a good way to learn those principles of width and length that we talked about, right? So for a small bust adjustment, we are going to be removing width and length in the bust. So we are going to start by drawing some key lines onto the pattern. So first you're going to come up through the waist dart, and night and day is kind of unique in that it has a cut out waist dart. So you don't have that like, triangle down here and paper behind there. You have a cut out triangle, but that's okay. Just come up through this point and then through the circle at the top of the waist dart. Next, you're going to draw a line through the bust dart. So go through that little triangle at the end, through the point of the dart, and draw a line connecting with your first line. And then finally, you are going to draw a line from the armhole down to this vertical line. So the general rule of thumb is that you should divide this armhole into thirds, and you're going to go 1/3 up the way of the armhole and then draw a connecting line down to your first vertical line. So you can just kind of eyeball that third, but this is roughly what it should look like, okay? And then the final line you're going to need is one that goes perpendicular to center front over to the dart. And it can just be a couple inches up from the waist. Again, don't get too caught up in like, am I doing this line at exactly the right place? Because it doesn't really matter, okay? So as long as you get in the ballpark of where you want to be, then you're fine. Okay, so now we're going to start cutting the lines. And by the way, all of this is the same for a full bust adjustment. So we're going to be looking at the same thing in the next chapter. All right, so you're going to cut up the first line you drew and continue going up to the armhole. And now you're going to leave a hinge at the armhole right there so that you're able to swing this out. Next, you are going to cut line number 2, leaving a hinge at the point yet again. Okay, like this. And then finally, you're going to cut all the way across line number 3. Okay, so what we have here is this is where you're essentially adding or removing width. So you can pull these pieces out. I'm going to straighten this. Pull these pieces out to create more room in the bust, making those darts bigger. Or you can overlap, which is what we're doing in this chapter, to make them smaller. And what happens with this piece is, like I said, this is where you're going to be adjusting the length. So let's say you make those darts bigger for a full bust adjustment, you're going to need to make the piece longer, right? So you're going to move this down to match. So this is what I'm talking about, needing to add width and length. But in the case of a small bust, you're going to be removing width and length. So you're going to be overlapping here, and then you're going to need to remove length at the front, right? Because a small bust needs less width and less length. Okay, but let's just look at how you're going to actually do this. So I like to keep this center front line straight. And then you can, if you didn't want any bust room at all, like let's say you don't want any darts in a pattern, and there are multiple reasons why you may not want that, you are going to keep overlapping these pieces until the original dart lines meet, right? This is your dart sew line, so you would want those to match. And then you would also want these lines, these dart lines to match. And then you would place that piece here. And then you would tape all these pieces together and draw a new side seam, right? And that is no bust room at all, no darts that need to be sewn. But let's say you don't want to go that far, right? You want to just remove a little bit of room from the bust. So let's say we were taking this down to an A cup. And like I said, in charm patterns, the difference between a B and an A is 1/2 inch. Now you divide 1/2 inch over the two, I was going to say quadrants, but let's say halves instead, right? So you have 2 halves on the front pattern. So for each side, you're going to be removing 1/4 inch. So just divide the number that you want to add or remove by half. So let's say we want to remove 1/4 inch of width. You would move this piece in 1/4 inch until it overlapped by 1/4 inch. And then you have some options here. You could keep this bust dart closed, right? If you wanted to keep the same amount of bust room, because honestly, this isn't like a huge dart right here. But if you wanted to make it a little bit smaller, because smaller darts mean less bust room, you would overlap here as well. So overlap by 1/4 inch there and overlap here as well. Okay, and so then once you're satisfied with the amount you're overlapping in both places, you would tape down. And then you would also move this piece up and tape it down. So you're moving the length piece up so that it matches the rest of the waistline. Now, you have to redraw in your darts. And one of the things that is super confusing is now that this dart point has moved in so far that you would have darts like way towards center front, which you don't want. So what I would suggest is that you keep the original point on the underlayer here. So I'm just going to kind of draw that in, or you can find a middle point that looks like it's going to be straight up from those legs. So about right here looks good. And again, if it seems like I'm guessing a little bit, it's because I am. It's because you don't know until you sew this up and you make your next muslin, right? So don't get too like, dragged down by all these details, because remember, you're going to be making another muslin. You really have to see if these changes have worked, to see if your darts are in the right position, all of that. So think of this as you are just trying to get in the ballpark of the changes you want. So that would be my new waist dart. And then here I'm going to make this my new bust dart point, and I'm going to connect it to the legs here. Okay, so there are my new darts. Now, the next thing you're going to have to do is true your darts and your seams. So when you close this dart, let's take a look at what happens. See how that looks a little crazy on the side there? So you're just going to close the dart, and I would just trim this off, honestly, and then you'll get your new, we want to trim off the underlayer too. That's your new true side seam. Now, with this waist dart, I'll put another piece of tape here. With this waist dart, you may need to put some more paper behind here, but let's take a look. So I always fold my darts towards center front, right? So the body of the dart goes towards center front. So I'm folding it. And it can be a little tricky once you have a bunch of tape and doubled layers here. But that's what you're looking for. And so see how now my waist isn't exactly matching up? It's pretty close, but it's not perfect. So when you are correcting your pattern, you're going to want to add a little paper under here. And this is the surgery I was talking about, because now you have a lot of layers going here. But you just need a little bit of paper added. And I'm going to grab my mat. And again, I'm going to fold it towards center front. And see where it's not matching up here? I'm going to redraw this waistline so it does match up. So from center front, I'm going to kind of angle it over here, like so that I have a nice waistline that matches up. And then I'm going to true my dart using this spiky tracing wheel, going over the folded portion of the dart. And then when I open it up, I can see my new cutting line where it's like perforated now, okay? And now some darts come out in big triangles, right? If they're bigger darts, they do. Some smaller darts are gonna go slightly up, which is what we're seeing now. Okay, so this would be my next piece that I use to make my next muslin. And like I said earlier, think about if there are any pieces that adjoin to this piece that you're going to need to make changes to. And the first one that comes to mind is like the all-in-one facing for the night and day dress, because we've taken out width right here. So you would look at how much you would overlap this piece where it meets up with the all-in-one facing, and you would make a slash on the all-in-one facing and then overlap it the same amount so that you don't have excess on the all-in-one facing inside your dress. Okay, so that would be the next thing you would do, and then you would make your next muslin. So, and you can keep adjusting as you go. If you found you've removed too much length at center front, you can always add that back at the waistline and check your dart position and all of that. But that would be your next step, is to make a muslin using this pattern piece. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the opposite, a full bust adjustment using the same pattern piece. Okay, let's take a look at a full bust adjustment, diagnosing those fit issues on the mannequin in the muslin. So we have sewn up the night and day bodice, the exact same one that we did for the small bust adjustment, in the same size. So again, we've done the B/C cup, knowing that she has a fuller bust and it probably wouldn't fit. So this mannequin, I know it says it's a C cup, this is a lingerie form, but it really fits more like a D cup up to an F cup in the world of charms. So we're gonna be taking a look at what we see here with the fit adjustments needed for a fuller bust. So just like we did with the small bust, the first thing I'm looking at is the fit across the bust line right here. And this one, you can see that it's quite taut here and it's pulling just the littlest bit. But the biggest issue that I see with the bust fit right off the bat is at the waistline. So you can see that this is riding up in the front, where this should meet the bottom of the twill tape on a dress form. We see that it's kind of curving up, meaning that she doesn't have enough length in the bust. And that pulling here, the tautness, is pointing towards her needing a little bit more width through the bust. The other thing you'll see is if I turn this to the side, you will look at this waistline and you can see how much it's riding up in the front. So once we do the full bust adjustment, that's going to lower that point here because we're going to be adding length. And the other really obvious thing that you'll see on this dress form is the side seam. See how it's straining towards the front and it's bowing? And you also see drag lines that are pointing towards the bust, meaning it's straining for more room in the front only, in the bust, okay? So just looking at this one, I would say she needs a full cup size added. So we're gonna do a full cup adjustment on her using a full bust adjustment method. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so let's take a look at how to do a full bust adjustment on the night and day dress. So what we're gonna do is we're going to draw in our lines. And if you watch the section on small bust adjustments, then you'll know that this is exactly the same. We are going to come up through the waist dart from that point through the circle at the top, extend another couple inches there. We are going to draw our second line through the bust dart, through the point, so that it meets with your first line. And then we're going to go roughly a third of a way up the armhole and draw a line connecting with the line from the waist dart. Finally, we're going to draw a line at a right angle to the center front line, about 2 inches up. Doesn't really matter, but about 2 inches is good. And so those are the lines we need. And we're going to start cutting. So we're going to take our first cut, we're going to call this line number 1, from the waist dart all the way up through the armhole line, but you're going to leave a hinge at the armhole like that so that we're able to spread this. And then secondly, I'm going to cut through my bust dart line, leaving a hinge at the end of it. And then finally, I'm going to cut all the way through line number 3. And this piece is going to be what adjusts the length. All right, so what we have here is pieces that we can spread to make the darts bigger, because a fuller bust needs bigger darts. And then we can make the front piece longer correspondingly, because like we said, remember, we need both added width and length. So this is the width we're adding, this is the length we're adding. Now, we're going to need some paper behind here. So grab a new sheet of paper and put your pattern on it. I'm going to tape down the center piece here. So the idea is this should stay parallel as you're working. And this is what moves, okay? So we're looking for, remember we talked about adding an inch per cup size. So if we're going up to a D/double D cup, we're gonna need to add an inch across the front. Now you're gonna divide that by 2, because we're only working on half the pattern here, right? This is one side and then you have the other side. So to gain a full cup size, we would need to increase the width by ½ inch. So you're going to take this and you want this to remain parallel here. And you would measure at ½ inch. Okay. And this slash on the bust dart is going to open up in a corresponding way. So you don't even have to really do anything to manipulate it, because once you move that piece, it's going to open up as much as it needs to. So you can tape all of this down. And this is something that I find happens a lot when you're doing this kind of drafting. You put a piece of paper behind and then you realize you didn't put enough, so you have to put another piece of paper behind. And so just keep adding paper as you need. And then you can always make a new copy of your pattern in the end. You should make a new pattern. So then we have this final piece, which we need to drag down until it is the same length as the other piece here. So it's a little harder with this open dart, but just take it down. You know, it's actually about ½ inch. So there we go. Until you're seeing these 2 parts of the pattern look level with each other. And we will true the waist seam in our next step, actually. Okay, so there's your expanded pattern piece. You've added your width, you've added your length, but now we need to true the darts and the seams. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is redraw my dart legs. I'm going to keep the point at the same place, or you could move it over a little. Actually, I think I will move it over a little. I'm going to put it between the slash right here, right in the middle of the slash. And then I'm going to redraw my dart legs to go up to that point. This would be the point where if you wanted to lower your dart, you could take it down an inch here like we talked about, and then redraw your dart legs to meet there. But whatever you want to do based on your first muslin fitting. I'm going to reconnect this. And now I'm going to true this dart. So again, that means I'm going to close the dart. You may want more tape. More tape so that those pieces stay together. I'm going to close the dart. And this actually looks pretty good. You may need to slightly, see how this side of the waist is just like 1/8 of an inch higher than the other. So what you're going to want to do is just redraw your waistline. And I have a habit of just kind of sketching things in like this, but of course you could use a ruler if you wanted to. And just connecting that line. And next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to grab my mat so I don't damage the table. Put it under, and then I'm going to roll over the folded dart. And then when I open it, I'll have a new line to follow. Now, because this is a cutout dart where we just have the seam allowance added, actually what I would do here is to redraw in the seam allowances, like so. And then you could cut out that triangle rather than keeping that dart excess there, but it's totally up to you. Okay, so next thing is the bust dart. So we're gonna want a little more paper behind there. So I'm just going to put a little tape. And I'm gonna redraw the dart legs. So I'm going to choose a point between, like right in the middle of the slash. And again, if you needed to adjust the dart length at all, now is when you would do it. But I'm just redrawing my dart legs to my dart point. And now I'm going to true it by closing up the dart. And with bust darts, you want to fold with the fold going down towards the waist, and redraw your side seam if needed. Mine looks pretty good actually. And we're going to roll over here and then just draw over your perforations so that you know where to cut here. Okay, so that's your full bust adjustment on the night and day dress. Now, the great thing about this method is that it doesn't change. Once the darts are closed, the seam lines are all still the same. So it's still going to sew to your back bodice piece at the side seam. Once the dart is closed, it's still going to sew to your skirt pieces because this length is the same. What's changed is the amount inside the dart, right? So that dart excess is what makes, adding more is what makes more room for the bust. The other thing I'm just going to repeat is that if you have any pieces that get sewn to this, for instance, the all-in-one facing, that is going to need to be changed now too, because it has gained room right here. So what I would do is I would take your front all-in-one facing, put it over this piece, and I would make a slash in the exact same position, leaving a pivot at the armhole and just spread your all-in-one facing to create the same amount of room that you have on your bodice. And you may need to do the same thing here, right? Because the all-in-one facing goes like that. So just keep that in mind. You're going to need to make similar changes to any pieces that get sewn to this. But before you adjust the facings, the next thing you're going to do is make your next muslin, right? So you still have to make another muslin, test it out, see if you want to make additional changes. And then once you're happy with this pattern, then you can adjust the facing pieces as needed. So there you have it. That is your full bust adjustment. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is how to do bust adjustments on different styles of pattern. Now, just keep in mind, no matter what type of pattern we're using, we still go back to the principles of adding length and width, or removing length and width, okay? So the first pattern we're gonna look at is the Las Vegas halter top, which we did this year on Patreon. And I really wanted to show this one because I feel like people get confused with bust adjustments on this because there are no darts, right? The bust room is provided through gathering. So you can see on the pattern, it says gather between notches. And that is the fullness that we built into the cup. And then these get gathered down until the notches match the midriff piece, right? So this is a kind of common vintage look to have a midriff seam and then gathering above it. So I wanted to show how to do a bust adjustment on this. So it's actually really easy, I'm happy to report. But some of the principles are similar to the full and small bust adjustments we did on the darted bodice. So the first thing you're going to do is find about the midway point between your notches. And just, remember that like in this case, the gathers are like the equivalent of a dart, right? That's what's providing that dart that bust fullness. So you're going to find that midway point, and then we're going to draw a line. I'm going to draw it parallel to the grain line here, up like this. And then we're going to do the third of a way up the armhole trick, though this isn't a full armhole. So kind of like, I'm going to divide this one in half about like that. And then we're going to draw a line over. So again, don't get too hung up on like, where does this point go? Where does that point go? They just have to connect, right? Okay, that's all you're worrying about. So those are the only lines you need. We don't have a side bust dart. Actually, there's one more line. There's one more line. The length line that we had on the last pattern. So you're going to take a line that is at a perfect right angle to the center front. And this is our length adjustment line. And I drew about 1.25 inches up, but again, not real important as long as it's sort of in the lower half of the piece. So first thing I'm going to do is cut up just like we did on the last adjustment, leaving the hinge at the armhole. And then I'm going to cut all the way across this length adjustment piece. So the cool thing about this is we can either add or remove, just like we did on our last example. But what we're going to be doing is removing width from where the gathers are or adding it. So you're either removing gathers or adding for fullness. So let's talk about removing first. So this would be your small bust adjustment on the Las Vegas halter top. You are going to overlap these pieces here by the amount you want to remove. So let's say you want to get down to an A cup, you would take out 1/4 inch. If you wanted to take out even more to reduce all bust fullness, then you would go even further, right? So, but again, this is something that you kind of have to work out with your body and the fit that you want. But let's say we do 1/4 inch, you would just do about that. And then we're going to, you would tape this in place, and then you would tape this piece, overlap it, and tape it in place, like so. And then this is your piece when you tape it down. So you have fewer gathers, but they're getting gathered into the same area. So again, you don't have to change anything about the piece at the seam. You're just doing fewer gathers. All right, so you would tape that in place, and that's your small bust adjustment. It's so simple. For a full bust adjustment, you would need to put paper behind because we're going to be spreading rather than overlapping. So you would just do the opposite. You would open this up the amount you want. So let's say you want to add a full cup size. You would open it up 1/2 inch at the slash, right? Tape this down. And then you would move your length piece so it's level over here. And again, you want it to be perpendicular at center front. And now you've gained more gathers between your notches. So again, all the sewing is the same, you're just gathering more fullness. And that's the full bust adjustment. Okay, so I've done the full bust adjustment, and the last thing I would do is just like connect any lines here and at center front. And then I'm going to cut out this pattern piece so that we can redraw the grain line, because you can see it got distorted here. And this is a handy trick to know too, to find a grain line if you're not sure where it's supposed to be. Often a grain line will be parallel to center front or center back. This one isn't. It goes down the center of the piece. So if you need to find a grain line, you can take the two edges of the piece, the two vertical edges, and put them together so that they are flush with each other like this. And then fold and then crease the piece at the halfway point, right? So then here, your crease would be your new grain line. Okay, so that's your new grain line. You're going to ignore this one. And that's your full bust adjustment. You would just sew it the same as you normally do, gather and match your notches. One final thing I'll say is that with full busted models we've used in the past, sometimes we want to add a little more neckline coverage too. This does give you more length, but it doesn't give you a lot of extra cleavage coverage, right? So if you do find you want more, instead of continuing to slash and spread there, you could add at the neckline here, right? So take this line and just add however much you want at center front and then taper it over. I'm obviously just sketching this in for now, but you get the idea, I hope. So let's say we want another like 5/8 of an inch of height at center front. That's what you would do. And then you would need to, this is self-lined, so you wouldn't even have to worry about adjusting a facing piece. So that is it, your adjustment for the Las Vegas halter top. Okay, so the next example we're going to talk about is princess seams. So I will preface this by saying that there are a lot of different ways to do full and small bust adjustments on princess seams. And one of the ways, if you Google this, and I suggest that you do because it's nice to see how other people do it. So if you Google this, you'll see that one really common way is not what I'm going to show you today, but it's kind of doing a similar angled cut on the side piece, opening this up, but then you add to the waist and then you have to take that away, right? So the way I'm going to show you is my preferred way, but it's not everyone's preferred way. What I like about it is that it doesn't affect the waist at all, so you're not going to have to go back and correct the width that you've added. I also just find it more intuitive and easy to remember, so here's how I do it, but like I said, I encourage you to go research other ways to do a bust adjustment on a princess seam. So we're going to come back to this idea of adding width and adding length. For a princess seam, let's look at the pattern. An important thing to know about a princess seam is that you have notches here, and they're usually on either side of the fullest part of the bust. So the side front panel will be the curviest one, and you'll have 2 notches on either side of that bust fullness. Then on your center front piece, this is the princess coat, by the way. So we're working on the princess coat, and you can see it has the shawl collar and everything, but we're just focused on this one seam. So then on the center front piece, you will have 2 coordinating notches, and what gives you bust fullness on a princess seam is it's not a dart, obviously, and it's not gathers like we had on the halter top example. It is easing, right? So when we draft a princess seam, we have extra ease built in on the curvier side. So if you look at these notches and try to line them up, you can see that the curvier side is actually longer, and you have to ease these pieces together to get them to match. So a common beginner mistake in sewing is to just try to match up the top notch, and then you keep sewing down to the bottom of the piece, and then you'll say, well, why is my side front piece so much longer than my center front piece? And it's because you didn't do the easing between the notches to build in that bust fullness, right? So that's to say that's how we build in the fullness on a princess seam. Now, let's look at an example of a small bust adjustment. When you're wearing the princess seam muslin, you're going to see that it looks like you have that extra width, you may have some extra length, and that sort of saggy look across the bust. So your first instinct may be to just take in the princess seams, and that's a very good instinct because that is actually how you would remove the width that you need. But what I will say is I prefer to start by just taking away from the side front. So let's say you want to take away a 1/4 inch, right? So you would just take it from this piece, and here I go doing my little sketchy thing again, down to the bottom notch, and then up. You can go a little further past that notch so that it's a natural looking curve, but you can see you're taking away some of the curve. So, and you can see on our patterns, because we have so many cup size, as you go from an A through an H cup on a princess seam, this piece will get continually curvier and rounder as you go up in cup sizes. So you want to make it a little flatter for the lower cup sizes. So that's the first thing I would do to remove the width that you need removed. But that doesn't address the length issue. So the next thing I'm going to show you is how you would remove length from these pieces without affecting the waist. So here's how we would add or remove length from the bust of the princess seam. You're going to, between these two notches, put your ruler at an angle over to the side seam and draw a line here. And then we're going to draw a coordinating line. Now this pattern is a little tricky because if I go right in the center of the notches, I'm going to be right at this break point here, which I kind of want to avoid. So I'm going to adjust a little bit and make it a little bit lower. It really doesn't matter. Like I said, it's just as long as you're in the ballpark. So I'm going to a little bit lower and draw a line across this piece that is perpendicular with center front. So this is like that length line we've been drawing on a lot of our pieces, right? And then this is similar to our bust dart line. But what we're going to do is kind of the opposite of how we've been cutting before. We're going to cut from the center to the side seam, leaving the hinge at the side seam. And then with this piece, we're going to cut all the way across. And once you've made your slash lines, now you can overlap this piece by as much length as you want to remove. And I will say it's good to know going into this alteration about how much length you want to remove, having looked at your muslin, right? So keep this in mind when looking at your muslin. So let's say you want to get rid of like a 1/4 inch like you did with the width, you would just overlap the full 1/4 inch here and tape it down. And then same thing on the center front panel. You would just overlap by a 1/4 inch, tape it down. Now, with this, you would need to draw in a new notch. You would need to adjust the facing, right? The lining piece that adjoins to this and the other lining, the side front lining piece. So you would need to make this adjustment on the inner pieces as well. If you were doing a huge adjustment here, you would need to redistribute the buttonholes and like redraw the break point. But if not, then if you're just doing this little 1/4 inch adjustment, I would say you're fine, okay? So that would be your small bust adjustment on a princess seam. Let's talk about a full bust adjustment. So let's undo this. And let's talk about how you would do the opposing adjustment. So you would, instead of removing width on this side front piece, you would add it, okay? So I would tape this down. This would be before you made your slash. So let's tape that back up. Tape this down, and then you would be adding to this curve here. So let's say you wanted to add 1/2 inch, right? You would just add it to the fullest part and then flatten out there and taper back down. And the great thing about going into your next round of muslins is you can easily pinch out more if you need to, or add more, whatever you need to do. So just get the general shape in there. And also, you need to transfer your notches. So whether you're removing, like we did on the small bust, you would take the notches in. Now we're adding, you would take the notch out. So just draw a line out to the edge and draw a new notch there. Okay, so that's adding your width. Now let's talk again about adding the length. So same thing on the front piece, you would just slash right across there. And also same thing on the side piece, we're going to do a slash with a pivot point. So I'm going to use my same line here. So to add length, I got to trim away this paper. So to add the length we need, we would just open this up put new paper behind and tape it down and redraw that curve, okay? So that would be your new side piece. And then same thing on the front, you would need to add the same amount of length. And now this is where, if we look at this, I would suggest you might need to redistribute your buttonholes, because now your first button is going to be quite a bit below your break point here, okay? So I would move this buttonhole up the amount you adjusted it and then redistribute the buttonhole, the center buttonhole, okay, between the two. So then you would just tape this down, and this is your new side piece, okay? Or your centerpiece, sorry. So this adjustment is great, like I said, because it doesn't affect the waistline, okay? You're not getting more width or removing width from the waistline. And it's just affecting what the princess seam does in the first place, which is to distribute this ease between these notches, right? So you would still match up your notches, just like we talked about on the gathered midriff version of the bust adjustment. Okay, so that is your bust adjustment on a princess seam. Okay, everyone, I hope you have loved learning about bust fitting adjustments today. If you want to learn more, don't forget to check out my book. Gertie's Ultimate Dress Book has a lot of information on bust fitting and goes really deep into the topic, so check that out. We have one fit clinic left for the year, and I'm super excited that we're going to be bringing you another one of your most requested topics for that. So as always, thank you all so much for being patrons. Thank you so much for watching this and for all of your support, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.